I know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. I remember one morning in March when a woman walked into my courtroom and made me question what I knew about character. I still hear the sound of her laugh, and I still feel the room change when she said what she said. I watched justice turn on a dime that day, and I watched pride melt into fear right in front of me. I want to tell you exactly what happened, because I still can't forget the look in her eyes when I finally said, "Tell me." But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for a long time, and I've walked into that courthouse more mornings than I can count. I've had my morning coffee the same way for 40 years, and I always take it strong and black. I've watched Christina, my clerk, learn my habits so well that she can read my face before I speak. I've learned that the law is written in books, but I've also learned that life is written on people's faces. I always get to the courthouse at 8:15, and I've been doing that since 1984. I always take the same steps, and I always feel that same little weight in my chest when I put on my robe. I've never thought of the robe as power, and I've always thought of it as responsibility. I've always told myself that I don't sit higher than people to look down on them, and I sit higher to see the whole picture. I grew up in Providence, and I grew up around people who worked with their hands. I remember my father coming home tired, and I remember his knuckles looking like they had been carved from stone. I remember him looking at me and telling me, in that quiet way of his, that a man's word is his bond. I remember him saying that respect isn't something you demand, and respect is something you earn. I came from an Italian immigrant family, and I never forget that my father came to this country with nothing but hope and a work ethic. I remember him telling me that America isn't perfect, but America gives you a chance if you show up and you try. I remember him telling me that the law should be a shield for the weak and a boundary for the strong. I remember him saying that the moment you think you're better than another person, you've already lost your way. I've been married to my wife for 48 years, and I still feel lucky when I think about that. I still listen for her footsteps when I come home, because I can tell what kind of day I had by how I greet her. I still tell her about the cases that stay with me, and I still watch her eyes soften when I talk about someone who needed mercy. I still let her remind me that people can be stubborn, and people can also be saved. I've learned early in my career that punishment can be easy and understanding can be hard. I've learned that some people come into my courtroom angry because they're scared. I've learned that some people come into my courtroom loud because they feel invisible. I've learned that some people come into my courtroom dressed in expensive clothes, and they still carry poverty in their spirit. I've seen every kind of excuse you can imagine, and I've heard every kind of lie people can tell themselves. I've also seen people tell the truth when it costs them, and I've seen people do the right thing when nobody is watching. I've learned that I can't fix everyone, but I can listen to everyone. I've learned that dignity is free, and I can offer it even when I have to enforce the rules. I remember that particular morning because I felt awake in a different way. I remember the air feeling sharp when I stepped out of my car. I remember the courthouse looking the same as always, but I remember my gut telling me to pay attention. I remember thinking to myself that something was waiting for me, even though I couldn't name it yet. I walked in and I nodded at the officers, and I always do that because I respect their work. I heard the echo of footsteps in the hallway, and I heard the low hum of people talking in the waiting area. I smelled that familiar mix of old paper, floor polish, and coffee that seems to live in every courthouse. I felt the day settling on my shoulders before I even reached my chambers. I stepped into my chambers and I saw Christina already moving, already organizing, already ready. I saw the stack of files on my desk, and I saw the sticky notes she had placed like little flags. I saw my name on the calendar, and I saw the long list of cases waiting for me. I felt the old rhythm of the job take over, like muscle memory. I heard Christina say, "Good morning, Judge," and I heard warmth in her voice. I looked up and I saw her holding that coffee exactly how I like it. I smiled because I've always believed small kindnesses keep the world from going cold. I took the cup and I felt the heat in my hand, and I felt myself settle. I always start my morning the same way, and I always look through the files before I take the bench. I always scan the charges, and I always look for patterns. I always ask myself who is careless, who is struggling, and who is lying. I always remind myself that every file is a person, and every person has a story I haven't heard yet. I remember that day because I saw a note in Christina's handwriting on the first file. I saw she had written, "Clean record, 30 years, nurse, single mom." I felt my eyebrows rise because those words mean something to me. I felt my mind already forming questions, and I felt myself leaning in before the case even started. I walked into my courtroom a few minutes later, and I heard the murmur of people waiting. I saw faces turn toward me, and I saw that mix of hope and dread that people carry when they come before a judge. I felt the weight of the room, and I felt the trust people place in the system, even when they're upset with it. I sat down and I placed my hands on the bench, and I looked out at my courtroom like I always do. I always take a second before I speak, and I always let the room settle. I always watch how people sit, how they hold their papers, and how they look at the officers. I always listen for the little sounds, like nervous breathing or impatient tapping, because those sounds tell me more than words sometimes. I remember that morning because I heard one sound that didn't fit. I heard a sharp little laugh from somewhere in the back, and I heard it cut through the quiet like a blade. I didn't look back right away because I had a docket to begin. I felt my jaw tighten for a moment, and I told myself I'd address it when I needed to. I looked at Christina and I nodded, and I started the session. I remember it was a Wednesday in March, and I remember the light outside looked pale through the courtroom windows. I remember the clock above the door, and I remember it felt like time was moving quickly. I remember I had that sense that the day would turn, and I remember I couldn't explain why. I called the first case, and I let my voice carry the way it always does, calm and steady. I watched the first person walk toward the front, and I watched her like I watch everyone. I saw her hold her purse tight against her side, and I saw her shoulders pulled inward. I saw her hair pulled back in a simple way, and I saw tiredness in her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. I saw her hands tremble just a little as she held her ticket. I looked down at the file, and I said her name the way Christina had written it. I saw her lift her chin and answer, and I saw she was trying to be brave. I asked her how she was doing, and I heard her say she was nervous. I told her she didn't have to be nervous with me, and I meant it. I looked at the charge, and I saw a basic traffic violation, a rolling stop at a sign. I looked at her and I asked her what happened, because I always want to hear it in their own words. I watched her swallow hard before she spoke, and I watched her eyes flick toward the officers. I listened closely because I could tell she wasn't there to argue, and I could tell she was there because she had to be. I heard her say, "Your Honor, I'm a nurse, and I was coming off a double shift." I heard her say she was driving home in the dark, and she was thinking about her kids. I heard her say she slowed down, and she thought the intersection was clear, and she made a mistake. I heard her say she wasn't trying to disrespect the law, and she was just exhausted. I asked her how long she had been driving, and I watched her blink like she wasn't sure why I asked. I heard her say, "Your Honor, I've been driving for 30 years. I asked her how many tickets she had in that time, and I watched her cheeks turn red. I heard her say, "Your Honor, I've had one ticket, and that was a long time ago." I felt my face soften, and I felt myself smile without forcing it. I looked at her and I said, "Tell me about those 30 years. I saw her eyes widen, and I saw her confusion turn into something like relief. I heard her laugh a little, but I heard it shake, like she was trying not to cry. I asked her what kind of nurse she was, and I heard her say she worked in an elderly care unit. I asked her what her shift was like, and I heard her say she had held an old man's hand as he passed away. I heard her say she had comforted a woman who was afraid to sleep because she thought she wouldn't wake up. I heard her say she had cleaned, lifted, and cared for people all night, and she hadn't sat down. I felt that familiar ache in my chest because I've always respected nurses. I remembered my own mother, and I remembered how she cared for people in our neighborhood with simple kindness. I remembered my father saying that the people who serve the sick are doing holy work, even if they never call it that. I looked at this woman, and I saw someone who gave herself away all day, and then came to my courtroom worried about a stop sign. I asked her about her children, and I heard her say she had two. I heard her say her daughter was applying for college, and she was trying to save money. I heard her say she was scared because a ticket meant insurance would go up. I heard her say she wasn't asking for special treatment, and she was only asking me to understand she wasn't reckless, and she wasn't careless by nature. I listened and I nodded, and I let her finish. I watched her grip the edge of the podium, and I watched her knuckles turn white. I looked at the officer, and I asked for his notes, because I always want the full picture. I heard the officer say she was polite, she was cooperative, and she didn't argue on the roadside. I felt the room leaning in, and I felt that quiet attention that happens when people recognize honesty. I looked back at her and I said, "I believe you." I saw her eyes fill instantly, and I saw her fight to hold it back. I told her I didn't want her driving tired, and I told her I wanted her to be safe, because her kids need her and her patients need her. I leaned forward and I said something I've said 100 times, but I said it like I meant it for her. I said, "I've learned one thing in 40 years. The law doesn't care about your bank account. It cares about your actions." I watched her nod because she understood I wasn't excusing her and I was seeing her. I paused and I felt the room quiet. I looked at her record again and I thought about 30 years of doing the right thing most of the time. I thought about one tired moment that could happen to any human being. I thought about what justice looks like when it has a heart, and I made my decision. I looked her directly in the eyes and I said, "I'm going to dismiss this." I heard a soft gasp somewhere behind her, and I heard her breath catch, like she couldn't believe it. I saw tears form in her eyes, and I saw her mouth tremble. I held up my hand gently because I didn't want her to fall apart in front of everyone. I said, "I'm dismissing it because I believe you learned something, and I believe your record means something." I said, "I'm dismissing it because you've shown responsibility for 30 years, and I'm not going to punish you like you're a danger to society." I said, "I want you to promise me you'll pull over if you're too tired to drive." I watched her nod over and over as if her head couldn't stop. I heard her whisper, "Thank you, Your Honor, I promise." And I heard how close she was to sobbing. I watched her step back, and I watched her wipe her cheeks fast, like she was embarrassed by her own gratitude. I saw her glance toward the back of the courtroom, and I saw her face tighten for a second. I didn't know yet why she looked that way, but I filed it away in my mind. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who thinks rules don't apply to them? Someone who believes money solves everything? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. I moved on to a few more cases, and I kept the pace steady. I heard apologies, I heard excuses, and I heard the shuffle of papers as people came and went. I kept thinking about that nurse, and I kept thinking about how close good people can come to trouble without meaning to. I kept thinking about my father's voice telling me that mercy is not weakness when it's earned. I remember I felt proud of my courtroom in that moment, and I don't say that often. I felt proud because I saw people watching, and I saw them recognize that justice can be fair without being cruel. I felt proud because I knew that nurse would walk out feeling seen, not crushed. I felt proud because I still believe the system works best when people feel they were heard. I also remember I heard that laugh again, and I heard it clearer this time. I heard it come from the back, and I heard it carry that sharp edge of disrespect. I looked up, and I finally turned my eyes toward the gallery. I saw a woman sitting there like she owned the room, and I saw her legs crossed like she was at a cafe. I saw her phone in her hand, and I saw her thumb moving fast as she texted. I saw her hair styled perfectly, and I saw jewelry that caught the light when she moved. I saw a designer handbag resting beside her chair like it was a pet. I watched her tilt her head and smirk at the people around her, and I felt my stomach drop a little. I told myself I couldn't judge her before I heard her case, and I always try to live by that. I told myself that expensive clothes don't always mean an expensive soul, and I've met rich people with humble hearts. I told myself to focus on the docket, and I did. I kept calling cases, and I kept my voice calm, but I kept that woman in the corner of my vision. I remember I saw the nurse, Mrs. Santos, pause near the door as she left. I remember I saw Mrs. Santos look back toward the gallery, and I remember I saw her expression tighten again. I remember I saw her straighten her shoulders like she was trying not to be affected by anything. I remember I watched her step out, and I remember I wished her peace in my mind. I kept working, and I kept listening, and I kept the courtroom moving. I remember the clock creeping toward 10:30, and I remember Christina flipping pages with that efficient rhythm of hers. I smelled coffee again when Christina took a sip near her desk, and I felt my own cup now cold beside me. I felt that quiet fatigue that comes from making decisions, even small ones, all morning. I heard Christina call a name that made that woman in the gallery stand quickly. I watched the woman rise, and I watched her adjust her coat like she was walking onto a stage. I watched her pick up her handbag, and I watched it swing from her arm like it had weight and meaning. I watched her walk to the front, and I watched her heels click against the floor with a kind of confidence that felt practiced. I looked down at the file, and I saw the name Montgomery. I saw multiple notations, and I saw the officer's handwriting packed tight. I saw the charge list, longer than the usual simple ticket. I felt my eyebrows lift, and I felt that quiet warning inside me grow louder. I looked up at her and I said, "Good morning." I heard her answer, but I heard it clipped, like she was doing me a favor. I asked her how she was doing, and I heard her say, "I'm busy, Your Honor." I felt my jaw tighten, because I don't like that tone, and I don't like what it implies. I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm looking at your file, and I'm seeing a charge for speeding and a charge for using a mobile device." I said, "I'm also seeing a failure to obey a traffic control device." I said, "I'm also seeing a note about an interaction with the officer that concerns me." I watched her blink slowly, as if she couldn't believe I was taking this seriously. I asked her what happened, and I watched her sigh dramatically. I heard her say, "Your Honor, I was late for an appointment, and I didn't hurt anyone." I heard her say, "I've already wasted enough time on this, and I just want to pay whatever it is and leave." I heard the word "whatever" land in my courtroom like litter on a clean floor. I leaned forward and I said, "I want you to understand something." I said, "I don't sell forgiveness here like it's a product." I said, "I don't want your money as much as I want your responsibility." I watched her lips press together, and I watched her eyes roll upward for a second, like she was checking the ceiling for patience. I heard myself take a slow breath, because I've learned the value of a pause. I felt my blood pressure rising, I'm not going to lie, and I didn't want it to take control of my voice. I looked at her and I said, "This is a court of law, not a shopping mall." I watched her smirk, and I saw her glance at her phone like she wanted to check it again. I asked her about her driving record, and I watched her shrug like it was irrelevant. I heard her say, "I'm sure it's fine." I looked at the record, and I saw it wasn't fine. I saw several prior stops, and I saw warnings that had been given before. I felt disappointment because I've seen this pattern, and I've never liked where it leads. I asked her if she remembered the officer, and I heard her say, "I remember he was rude." I asked her what she meant, and I heard her say, "I mean, I told him who I am, and he acted like it didn't matter." I felt the room stiffen, and I felt people listening in a different way now. I looked at her and I said, "Who you are should never matter more than what you did." I saw her lift her chin, and I heard her say something I'll never forget in 40 years. I heard her say, "Your Honor, I donate more to charities in a month than most people make in a year." I heard her say, "I think that should count for something." I felt my stomach twist because I've seen people use charity like a shield, and I've never respected that. I took off my glasses and I rubbed my eyes, and I did it slowly so I wouldn't say the wrong thing. I put my glasses back on and I looked straight at her. I said, "Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy character, and it definitely can't buy your way above the law." I felt the words settle in the room like heavy stones. I watched her laugh, and I heard it echo across my courtroom. I couldn't believe it, and I felt heat rise into my face. I saw Christina close her eyes and shake her head just a little, like she was thinking, "Not today." I heard a few people in the gallery whisper, and I heard a man mutter under his breath in disgust. I kept my voice level and I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, I want you to stop laughing." I said, "I want you to look around you and understand where you are." I said, "I want you to respect this process because it protects everyone, including you." I watched her bite her lip like she was holding back another laugh. I asked her a simple question, and I said, "Do you understand the seriousness of these charges?" I heard her answer, and I heard her say, "I understand that I don't have time for this." I heard her say, "I have a lunch appointment." I heard her say it like that lunch mattered more than the law. I leaned forward and I said, "You'll make time." I said, "You'll make time because this is a court of law, and you're not above it." I watched her eyes narrow, and I watched her look at me like I was an obstacle. I felt the room hold its breath, and I felt myself walking a line between patience and firmness. I asked her what speed she was going, and I watched her wave her hand like she was swatting a fly. I heard her say, "I was probably going a little fast." I looked at the officer's note, and I saw the number. I looked up and I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, the officer clocked you at 52 and a 25. I felt the courtroom react without words, and I heard a soft, "Wow," from someone near the back. I watched her blink, and I watched her try to smile, as if it was cute. I heard her say, "I drive a nice car, Your Honor, and it doesn't feel fast." I felt my patience thinning because I've heard that excuse, and it's never been a good one. I said, "Your car might be nice, but your choices were not." I asked her if she was on her phone, and I watched her tilt her head. I heard her say, "I might have checked a message." I heard her say, "I run a business, and people need me." I felt anger flicker, because I've sat with families who lost someone to distracted driving. I remembered cases where apologies came too late, and I didn't want to hear her casual tone. I said, "I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." I said, "I've sat on this bench, and I've told mothers that their son isn't coming home." I said, "I've heard fathers cry like children because a text message took a life." I watched her face change just a little, and I watched the smirk fade for a second. I heard myself soften my tone, not for her comfort, but for the truth. I said, "Your choices on the road can destroy someone's life in an instant." I said, "I don't care how important you think you are." I said, "Nobody is more important than someone else's safety." I watched her swallow, and I watched her eyes flick away. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. If you've ever felt that frustration watching someone disrespect something important, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, I never saw coming in my entire career. I asked her why she spoke to the officer the way she did, because I had read the note and I didn't like it. I heard her say, "I told him I know people." I heard her say, "I told him I could make problems for him." I felt my stomach drop, because that wasn't arrogance anymore, and that was something darker. I leaned back and I felt the wood of my chair against my shoulders. I looked at Christina and I saw her eyes widen slightly, as if she was thinking the same thing I was thinking. I felt my gut telling me to pay attention, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise. I told myself that sometimes people talk big when they're embarrassed, and I told myself I needed more information. I asked the officer to speak, and I watched him step forward. I heard him say she had been speeding, and she had been weaving, and she had been looking down at her phone. I heard him say he pulled her over, and she immediately demanded to know his badge number. I heard him say she told him she owned half this city, and she told him he worked for her taxes. I felt that old anger rise again, because I've always hated that kind of talk. I've always believed that a badge is not a toy, and it's a symbol of service. I looked at Mrs. Montgomery and I said, "I told you something my father taught me." He said, "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. And you've earned nothing but contempt here today." I heard the room go still, and I felt the words land. I watched her face harden, and I heard her say, "Your Honor, I spend more on shoes than this fine." I heard her say it with a little laugh, like she thought it was clever. I felt my patience snap into clarity, and I felt myself become very calm. I've learned that the moment I get too emotional, I lose control, and I wasn't going to lose control. I looked directly at her and I said, "I'm not impressed by what you spend." I said, "I'm impressed by how you treat people when you think you don't need them." I said, "I'm impressed by humility, and I'm not seeing any." I watched her grip her handbag strap tighter, and I watched her eyes flash with annoyance. I said, "In my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground, and that's how it should be." I felt myself remember Mrs. Santos, and I felt myself remember the way she held back tears when I dismissed her case. I felt myself remember the look on Mrs. Santos's face when she glanced toward the gallery. I felt myself wonder if Mrs. Santos had seen this woman before, and I didn't know why that thought came to me, but it did. I asked Mrs. Montgomery where she was going in such a hurry, and I watched her roll her eyes. I heard her say, "I was going to a meeting." I heard her say, "I have investors." I heard her say, "I'm building something big." I felt that phrase, "something big," hang in the air, and I felt my instincts tug at me again. I asked her what kind of business she ran, and I watched her hesitate for the first time. I heard her say, "I run several companies." I heard her say, "It's complicated." I heard her say, "It's not relevant." I felt my gut tighten, because hesitation is often the first crack in a mask. I heard myself take a deep breath and count to 10 in my head. I looked at her and I said, "It is relevant when you use it as a weapon." I said, It is relevant when you try to intimidate an officer. I said, it is relevant when you act like rules are for other people. I watched her jaw clench, and I watched her glance toward the door like she was checking for an escape. I thought about issuing a fine and moving on, because traffic court can be like that sometimes. I thought about how easy it would be to give her a number and let her pay it without feeling it. I also thought about how I would feel later if I let disrespect slide in my courtroom. I felt my father's voice again, and I felt him saying that boundaries matter. I said, I'm going to address the speeding and the phone use, and I'm also going to address your behavior. I said, I'm not going to allow threats toward an officer. I watched her open her mouth, and I watched her stop herself. I saw a flicker of calculation in her eyes, and I saw her trying to decide what tactic would work best. I heard her change her tone, and I heard her say, Your Honor, I'm sorry if I came across rude. I heard her say, I was under stress. I heard her say, I'm sure we can resolve this quickly. I heard the word resolve like she was negotiating a deal, and I didn't like that. I said, I don't resolve justice like a business transaction. I said, I apply the law, and I consider the person in front of me. I said, I consider your record, and I consider your attitude. I watched her nod as if she understood, but I felt she didn't. I started to speak about the fine, and I started to say what I thought would be appropriate. I felt the courtroom shifting again, and I felt that earlier sense that something was waiting for me. I heard a chair scrape behind me in the gallery. I heard a man clear his throat, and I heard the sound carry in the quiet. I looked up, and I saw a man stand near the back with a calm posture. I saw him hold up identification in a respectful way. I heard him say, Your Honor, I'm an assistant United States attorney. I felt a jolt go through me because that doesn't happen in a routine traffic session. I looked at Christina, and I saw her already reaching for something. I saw her take a sealed envelope from a folder that hadn't been on my desk earlier. I felt my stomach drop because I knew Christina wouldn't place something like that in front of me unless it mattered. I heard the small sound of the envelope as she set it down, and I felt the weight of it without even touching it. I picked up the envelope and I looked at the seal. I felt the room go silent in a way that wasn't normal silence, and I felt people lean forward without moving. I heard Mrs. Montgomery shift her feet, and I heard her swallow hard. I looked at her and I saw the first real crack in her confidence, and I saw it flash across her face like a shadow. Before I tell you what those charges were, let me ask you this. Do you think wealth should protect someone from consequences? Should money put you above the law? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you believe everyone should be equal under the law like I do, hit that subscribe button. I opened the envelope and I unfolded the paper inside. I read the first line and I felt my eyes widen. I read the next line and I felt my throat go dry. I remember thinking, in 40 years I had never seen anything like this in the middle of a traffic case. I looked up at the assistant U.S. attorney and I asked him to explain because I wanted to be sure I wasn't misunderstanding. I heard him speak clearly, and I heard him say they were running a federal investigation. I heard him say Mrs. Montgomery was connected to a string of fraudulent charity accounts. I heard him say money meant for medical families and community relief had been routed through shell companies. I felt my stomach twist because I had just dismissed a nurse's case, and I had heard that nurse talk about caring for the vulnerable. I felt anger rise, but I kept my face calm. I heard him say they had traced payments, identities, and false invoices. I heard him say the evidence was strong and they were ready to take her into custody. I looked at Mrs. Montgomery and I watched the color drain from her face. I saw her mouth open slightly and I saw her blink fast like she was trying to wake up. I saw her hands start to shake, and I saw the same hands that had been so casual before now look lost. I felt the whole courtroom change, and I felt that earlier laugh die in everyone's memory. I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, I want you to listen to me." I said it slowly, and I said it with a firmness that comes from truth. I said, 2 hours ago I heard you laugh in my courtroom. I said, 2 hours ago I heard you talk about shoes like they mattered more than rules. I said, right now I want you to understand that the law you mocked is bigger than your ego. I watched her eyes fill with tears, and I watched her try to hold them back like Mrs. Santos had. I heard her whisper, "Your Honor, please." I heard her say, "I didn't do anything." I heard her say, "I don't understand." I felt the first sting of sadness because I've seen fear before, and fear can make anyone sound small. I looked at the Assistant U.S. Attorney again, and I asked what the immediate request was. I heard him say federal agents were present to execute an arrest. I heard him say they needed the courtroom to remain calm and orderly. I heard him say they wanted to proceed without chaos. I felt myself become very still, because in moments like that, the judge's tone becomes the room's tone. I looked out and I said, "I want everyone to remain seated." I said, "I want everyone to stay calm." I said, "I want everyone to respect this process, because this is what justice looks like when it moves." I felt the air tighten, and I heard someone take a shaky breath. I watched Mrs. Montgomery grip the edge of the podium, and I watched her nails press into the wood. I heard her voice crack as she said, "I can fix this." I heard her say, "I can pay whatever it is." I heard her say it out of habit, like money was her first language. I leaned forward and I said, "I want you to hear me, and I want you to hear me clearly." I said, "Money can't fix what you broke if what you broke was trust." I said, "Money can't buy integrity, and it can't buy respect." I watched her flinch as if the words struck her harder than any fine. I saw federal agents step into view from the side aisle, and I watched the badges catch the light. I watched their faces stay calm because professionals don't need theatrics. I heard the soft sound of their shoes as they approached, and I heard the room hold its breath again. I felt time slow down, and I felt every second stretch. I watched the agents come to her side, and I watched her turn her head quickly like she was searching for someone to rescue her. I watched her look back toward the gallery, and I watched her eyes scan faces that wouldn't meet hers. I watched her swallow, and I watched tears spill now without her permission. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness, because I never enjoy seeing a human being collapse, even when they earned it. I heard an agent speak, and I heard him say her name. I heard him say she was under arrest on federal charges that included wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. I heard the words land heavy, and I heard a few people gasp. I watched Mrs. Montgomery's knees buckle slightly, and I watched her grab the podium to keep herself standing. I watched the agents put handcuffs on her, and I'll never forget the sound. I heard the metal click, and I heard it echo in my courtroom like a final answer. I watched her shoulders slump, and I watched her expensive coat wrinkle in a way she couldn't control. I watched that designer handbag slip from her arm and fall to the floor, and I watched it land with a soft thud that somehow felt loud. I saw nobody pick it up, and I felt that detail stick in my mind. I thought about how she had carried it like a symbol, and I thought about how it looked meaningless on the floor. I thought about Mrs. Santos, the nurse she had laughed at in the gallery. I thought about how Mrs. Santos probably knew what it felt like to watch money treated like a crown while ordinary people struggled. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these, seeing that the law really does apply to everyone equally. If this story is restoring your faith in justice, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to see it. I watched the agents guide her toward the door, and I watched her try to walk with dignity she didn't have anymore. I heard her sob quietly, and I heard her say, "I'm sorry," but I didn't know who she was saying it to. I heard her say, "Please," again and again, like the word might open a door back to her old life. I felt the courtroom remain silent, because silence is sometimes the only respectful response to a moment like that. I sat there for a second after she left, and I felt the room still vibrating. I felt my own heart beating steady, but I felt a tightness in my chest. I took a deep breath, and I reminded myself that my job is to hold the line. I reminded myself that I don't celebrate, and I simply witness. I looked at Christina, and I saw her eyes wide, and I saw her hand resting on her papers like she needed something solid. I nodded at her, and I told her we were going to continue. I heard myself call the next case, and I heard my voice return to normal, because that's what the courtroom needs. I felt the day keep moving, because life doesn't pause just because something dramatic happened. I finished the docket later, and I walked back into my chambers with a heaviness that surprised me. I sat down, and I stared at the empty coffee cup on my desk, like I had forgotten it was there. I felt the quiet after court, and I heard the muffled sounds of the building settling. I took off my robe, and I hung it carefully, because routine can steady a person. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock, and I saw the assistant U.S. attorney step into my chambers. I invited him in, and I offered him a seat, because I wanted to understand what I had just witnessed. I asked him how long the investigation had been going on. I heard him say it had been months, and he said they had been careful because money crimes hide behind paperwork. I listened as he explained the full investigation, and I learned details that made my stomach turn. I heard him say they had traced donations from ordinary people, and those donations had been drained into luxury purchases. I heard him say they had found forged documents, fake charity websites, and stolen identities. I heard him say the numbers were staggering, and I heard him say millions of dollars, like it was a weight he hated to carry. I sat there thinking about how I almost just gave her a fine and sent her on her way. I imagined her walking out laughing, still texting, still believing she was untouchable. I felt chills because I realized how close she came to slipping through one more time. I thank him for doing the work because I respect any person who brings darkness into the light. I asked him how they knew she'd be in my courtroom that day, and I heard him say they tracked her schedule. I heard him say they chose traffic court because she would show up, and she would be in a public place with controlled security. I heard him say they didn't want a scene at her home because they feared she might destroy evidence. I felt that quiet appreciation for planning because good justice is careful justice. I asked him about the victims because that's where my mind always goes. I heard him say the victims were families who donated to causes they believed in. I heard him say the victims were also elderly people whose identities were stolen. I heard him say some victims were sick children's foundations that had to shut down because donations dried up. I felt a wave of anger because I imagined those families and I imagined their trust being used like fuel. I looked down at my desk and I said, I saw her laugh in my courtroom. I said, I heard her brag about shoes. I said, I heard her act like charity was a get out of consequences card. I heard him say they had seen that attitude in interviews and they believed entitlement was part of how she justified what she did. I felt that word justified hit me because I've seen people justify terrible things when they stop seeing others as human. That night I went home and I walked into my kitchen like I always do. I saw my wife glance at my face and I knew she could tell I had a heavy day. I sat down and I told her what happened, and I felt my voice get quiet when I described the handcuffs. I heard my wife say, I'm glad they caught her, and I heard sadness in her tone too, because decent people don't enjoy suffering. I thought about my grandson, and I remembered he turned 12 last week. I thought about how he watches me sometimes when I talk, and I thought about what kind of world he's learning from. I told myself that stories like this matter because they teach children that rules are real. I told myself they also teach children that kindness is real because I saw it in Mrs. Santos's face that morning. 2 months later, I received a letter, and I saw the return address before I saw the name. I almost didn't open it, and I'll tell you why. I've received letters from prison before, and some are angry, and some are manipulative. I felt my hand hover over the envelope, and I felt myself wonder if I needed to read it at all. I opened it anyway, because I've never believed in turning away from accountability. I unfolded the paper, and I saw careful handwriting, and I could tell she had written it slowly. I read the first sentence, and I felt a strange tug in my chest. I read the next lines, and I felt myself breathing deeper, because I could hear her voice in the words. I heard her say in the letter, Your Honor, I'm writing because I saw myself in your eyes that day. I heard her say, I saw disgust and I saw disappointment. I heard her say, I thought money made me safe and I thought money made me important. I heard her say, I didn't realize I had become someone I wouldn't even respect. I kept reading, and I felt the room of my chambers around me disappear for a moment. I heard her say, I'm sitting in a cell now, and I finally understand what it means to be equal. I heard her say, I used to think equality was a slogan, and now I feel it in my bones. I heard her say, I'm scared, and I'm ashamed, and I don't know if I can change, but I want to try. I'm not going to lie to you, and I felt myself torn as I read. I felt anger because of what she had done to vulnerable people. I also felt that old judge's awareness that people can be complicated even when they do ugly things. I thought about my father's words again, and I remembered him saying that pride is a poison that can turn a person into a stranger to themselves. I finished the letter, and I sat back in my chair. I didn't excuse her, and I didn't forgive her in a magical way. I simply allowed room in my heart for the possibility that fear can teach what comfort never will. I told myself that consequences can be a teacher, and I hoped she would actually learn, not just regret getting caught. A few days after that letter, I saw something that brought the story full circle for me. I was finishing a morning session when Christina told me someone wanted to see me briefly. I walked into the hallway and I saw Mrs. Santos standing there, holding her purse in both hands. I saw her smile, and I saw that same tired kindness in her eyes. I invited her into my chambers, and I asked her how she was doing. I heard her say she was doing better, and she said her daughter had gotten into college. I heard her say her daughter had been worried about money, and she had been applying for scholarships like it was a second job. I heard her say she came to thank me again, and she said she never forgot the moment I said, "Tell me about those 30 years." I felt my eyes sting, and I felt myself blink a few times to keep it together. I told her she didn't owe me thanks, and I told her she earned that mercy with her life choices. I asked her why she looked back toward the gallery that morning, because I still remembered it. I heard her take a breath, and I heard her say, "Your Honor, I recognize that woman." I listened carefully, and I felt the story tighten like a knot. I heard Mrs. Santos say she had once donated to a charity online that promised to help families with medical bills. I heard her say she donated because she sees suffering every day, and she wanted to help. I heard her say she later discovered her identity had been used for suspicious accounts. I heard her say she never proved it, but she always suspected the charity was fake. I felt my stomach turn, because now I understood why Mrs. Santos's eyes had tightened. I felt anger because I imagined a nurse giving what little she could, and I imagined someone turning that kindness into a crime. I looked at Mrs. Santos and I said, "I'm sorry." I said it because I meant it, and I said it because some apologies are owed even when I'm not the one who did the harm. I heard Mrs. Santos say, "Your Honor, I didn't come here for that." I heard her say, "I came here because I want you to know something good came out of it." I watched her reach into her purse, and I watched her pull out a folded paper. I watched her hands shake a little, and I watched her smile through it. I heard her say, "Your Honor, the U.S. Attorney's Office told me some money was recovered." I heard her say, "They told me part of it was put into a scholarship fund for local kids going into healthcare." I heard her say, "They told me the first scholarship went to my daughter." I felt tears come to my eyes when she said that, and I didn't even try to stop them. I stood up from my chair, and I rarely do that in moments like this, but I did. I walked around my desk, and I held out my hand, and I shook hers. I told her I was proud of her daughter, and I told her I was proud of her. I felt the weight of the whole day from March lift just a little, because justice had reached beyond punishment and into repair. I watched Mrs. Santos wipe her cheeks, and I watched her laugh softly. I heard her say, "Your Honor, I tell my daughter that you treated me like a person." I heard her say, "I tell her that fairness can have a heart." I heard her say, "I tell her that the law isn't just there to scare you, and it's there to protect you." I felt my chest tighten again, because that is exactly what I want people to believe. I think about that day often, and I think about what it taught me. I think about the contrast between two women in the same room. I think about one woman who carried responsibility for 30 years and still felt ashamed of one mistake. I think about another woman who carried money like armor and still felt entitled to more. I think about my father, and I remember him coming home with dirt on his shoes and pride in his eyes. I remember him telling me that honest work makes you sleep better than any luxury bed. I remember him telling me that character is what you do when you're tired, when you're tempted, and when nobody is watching. I still believe that more than ever. I've learned one thing in 40 years on this bench, and I've learned it over and over in different faces. I've learned that money can rent you comfort, but money can't rent you peace. I've learned that power can open doors, but power can't close the door on consequence forever. I've learned that the law is the great equalizer when we have the courage to apply it evenly. I don't tell these stories to embarrass people, and I don't tell these stories to make myself look tough. I tell these stories because I want you to know what people don't see on TV. I want you to know that real justice is often quiet, and it's often a conversation. I want you to know that sometimes the biggest lesson isn't the fine, and it's the moment someone finally sees themselves clearly. I want you to remember those words I said, and I want you to carry them into your own life. I said, money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy character, and it definitely can't buy your way above the law. I said, respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. I said, in my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her, or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone who believes that character matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law. Every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you. And remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.